도대체 이제 앞으로 뭘 해야 되지?
Inflation developments in the world are now on a new page.
There's a big mystery about the impacts of quantitative easing.
So I think a hard landing is coming. It's just a question of when it's going to happen. Well, there's two real consequences of the Ukraine war for the global economy. Number one, higher energy prices and restrictions in energy supplies, especially to Europe, which are quite significant for European economic activity. And number two, there's real questions about whether the global grain supply will be adequate this year. So you're seeing a very large increases, for example, in wheat prices. So it's an inflation shock, both on the energy side and on the food side. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine has disrupted energy flows from Russia to the rest of the world because of sanctions. And also because Russia is using energy as a weapon to try to coerce Europe to not provide as much support to Ukraine as Europe is providing. So the diminishment in energy supplies, coupled with questions about whether Ukraine can actually export the grain that they produce and have in storage, has led to very significant increases in global energy prices and food prices. Well, there certainly seems to be, we're already pulling back from the trend to globalization, and you can see that just in the sense of people saying, oh, I need to have more redundancy in terms of my supply chains. I need to have, production coming from, more than one source, or I need to locate that production closer to where I actually sell the final goods and services. So that's one thing. The second thing that's going on, of course, is there's the rivalry between China and the US has intensified. And so you certainly worry about the fact that we're moving from a one world economy to potentially a two world economy where there's a sort of Chinese bloc and there's a US European bloc. And that would also be pretty damaging to the success of the global economy. And the last thing I think is that the whole theory of the case is shown to be flawed. So if you think about the Ukraine-Russian war, the idea was that countries would not invade other countries because they had a stake in the global economy. And if they invaded another country, there would be sanctions, and those sanctions would cause great damage to their economy. And so therefore they wouldn't do this. Russia would not invade Ukraine. Well, we found out that the risk of sanctions, the risk of damage to the Russian economy did not deter Vladimir Putin. And so that's another sort of flaw that we discovered in the global order. The security apparatus that we had at an international level was not sufficient to prevent Putin from going into Ukraine, which is really, deeply unfortunate. The response to the pandemic was extraordinarily easy monetary policy and extraordinary expansive fiscal policy. So a lot of money was sent out to American households and businesses. Even after the vaccines came out and the pandemic looked to be more under control, the Biden administration passed a stimulus bill of $1.9 trillion. And this sent checks to most households in the United States, regardless of whether they actually needed the money or not. So it was sent to a lot of people that were actually employed and had plenty of resources. So I think it's a combination of the very accommodative monetary policy, the very stimulative fiscal policy, and the reopening up of the economy, which obviously has caused people to go out and do things again that they weren't doing prior to during the pandemic. The U.S. labor market just turned out to be much, much tighter than the Federal Reserve expected. If you go back to 2021 and you listen to how the Fed characterized the labor market, they kept talking about how much the level of employment was still falling well short of where we were in February 2020. Well, it turns out we're still a little bit short of where we were in February 2020, but there is no slack in the U.S. labor market. I mean, what happened was people retired because of the pandemic. Some people got sick, long COVID. And so all those things have caused the labor market to be much tighter than what the Fed ever anticipated. In many countries, people just dialed back people's work hours. They didn't lay off workers. And here you saw a lot of layoffs and a lot of separation of people from their employer. And so I think that created a lot more friction in the labor market once you started to reopen. because the people were no longer attached to their former employer. And so when their former employer wanted them to come back, they had already gone on to do something completely different. That's exacerbated the tightness in the U.S. labor market. It's exacerbated the upward pressure on wages. And that's something that's causing more persistence to inflation as a consequence. Well, I think the Fed made a mistake in being so slow to reverse course on monetary policy. If you remember back in 2021, the Federal Reserve was reluctant to even talk about ending their asset purchases. They talked about how, well, we don't want to talk about it too soon because then that will just get people anxious about when we're going to raise short-term interest rates. And so they delayed the taper of the asset purchases. So, it's a pretty unusual situation where as recently as March of this year, the Fed was still buying assets and short-term interest rates were still at zero, even though the economy was growing fast and inflation was well above the Fed's objective. So I think it's fair to say that the Fed was, too slow to remove monetary policy accommodation. What I'm more worried about, though, is really whether the Federal Reserve is going to essentially cause a recession, not in 2022, but in 2023 or beyond. Because the Fed's track record of tightening monetary policy to slow the economy down, to push the unemployment rate up, to get inflation back to the target, in the past, whenever they've had to push the unemployment rate up by any meaningful amount, the consequence has been full-blown recession. Now, I don't think there's going to be a recession in 2022. I think the economy still has quite a bit of forward momentum. Household balance sheets are in good shape. Demand in many areas is above supply. And so even if you tighten monetary policy and reduce demand, I think supply will continue to expand to try to accommodate that shortfall of supply relative to demand. But in 2023, I think there is much more risk of a recession. And it really comes down to whether the Federal Reserve is prepared to make monetary policy tight or not. Are they prepared to tighten monetary policy sufficiently to push up the unemployment rate to get inflation back to 2%? If the Federal Reserve wants to push the unemployment rate up, which I think they're going to have to do to get inflation back to 2%, historically there's been no examples of a significant rise in the unemployment rate without a recession. So Chair Powell in his recent remarks has talked about a few episodes of soft landing in the United States, 1965, 1966, 1984-85, 1993-95. All three of those episodes, the Fed tightened, the economy slowed, the U.S. did not go into recession. But those episodes are not really a very good description of where we are today, because in all of those episodes, the unemployment rate kept falling. Every time the unemployment rate's gone up by 0.5% or more, next stop is a full-blown recession. That just shows you how hard it is for the Fed to engineer a soft landing. They're clearly going to try. I mean, that's the goal. The goal is to tighten monetary policy sufficiently to reduce the demand for labor enough to slow the economy down, and hopefully they can slow it enough to keep inflation, push inflation down, but not so much to actually generate an economic downturn. That's a very small quarter that they have to sort of reach to pull this off. So I think the odds of that happening are quite low. If the labor market, I mean, we want to have a tight labor market. We want to have as many people employed as possible. But if the demand for labor exceeds the supply, then businesses are going to have to pay higher wages as they compete for workers. And when the labor market is very tight, more people can move from one employer to the other. If you look at how wages go up, a lot of the wage inflation problem isn't just people getting paid more at their current employer. It's the fact that there's opportunities for them to move from one job to another at a different employer, and that's where you actually see pretty significant rises in wages. So it essentially gives workers more power relative to business. And so the consequence of a too tight labor market is that wages move up. We've seen that in the United States. Wages are rising at about 5%, 5.5% on a year-over-year basis, depending on which indice you look at. And that's not consistent with 2% inflation. That's probably consistent with inflation closer to 4% rather than 2%. The good news for the Fed is people are still confident the Fed is going to do their job. And as a consequence of that, inflation expectations are still stayed remarkably well anchored. surprisingly so, frankly, given the actual inflation performance. Now, if people start to lose confidence in the Fed and inflation expectations start to drift up, then we have a much bigger problem. Because if inflation expectations move up, then that feeds into the wage setting process. Wages then drive prices, prices then drive wages, and that's how you get a wage price spiral. But as long as inflation expectations are well anchored, the risk of a wage price spiral at this point is still pretty low. Watching the U.S. labor participation rate is going to be very, very important over the next year, because if the labor force participation rate moves up, that will help the Fed because it will generate a little bit more slack in the U.S. labor market. The labor force participation rate in the U.S. is increasing again, but whether that will happen fast enough, more powerfully enough to sort of bail the Federal Reserve out remains an open question. I think the first thing the Fed has to hope for is good luck. Obviously, the Ukraine war has made the situation more difficult because on top of all these other inflation pressures, you now have a energy price shock and a food price shock. So the Federal Reserve needs some luck. So what might luck consist of in this case? Well, one thing would be that there's more slack in the labor market than we think, because the labor force participation rate could come back more quickly. So if more people re-enter the labor force, that will help the Fed. Another piece of luck will be inflation expectations continue to stay very well anchored. Another piece of luck would be the wage inflation trend doesn't continue to accelerate. Assessment of what a neutral monetary policy in the U.S., most people think of it as at 2% inflation, the federal funds rate would need to be around 2.5%. Well, inflation's higher than that, so neutral is higher than that. They recognize that they're behind. They're going to move pretty rapidly to neutral over the next 6 to 12 months. The good news is the market understands that, so that's already been priced in. It's already fully anticipated by markets. Markets expect the Federal Reserve to take the federal funds rate up to around 3%. We'll see if that's high enough to slow the economy down sufficiently to push inflation back to 2%. I think probably won't be high enough, but at least the Fed's got 3% priced in. They didn't have 3% priced in 6 months ago. And then once they get the federal funds rate up to maybe 2.5% or so, they'll look around and sort of see, how are we doing on growth? How are we doing on the tightness of the labor market? How are we doing on inflation and inflation expectations? Do we actually need to move monetary policy further to a tight monetary policy setting? I think the answer to the question that they will have to move monetary policy further, but I think at this point, they're being a little cagey about how far they actually need to go. Well, I think the biggest consequence of the rise in U.S. rates and the fact that the U.S. is going sort of earlier and faster than many other countries is the appreciation of the dollar. As U.S. interest rates rise, that makes U.S. bonds more attractive relative to other countries. Capital then flows to the U.S., and as it tries to do that, then the dollar appreciates. Not a big problem, I don't think, for Korea. I mean, basically makes Korean exports more competitive vis-a-vis U.S. produced manufacturing. The big consequence, though, I think, of the strength of the dollar is really for low and moderate income countries who have a lot of outstanding dollar-denominated debt. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on poor countries who have a lot of government debt outstanding denominated in dollars, and the dollar strength will just exacerbate that problem. We've already started to see some defaults among countries who are less strong in terms of their financial strength. And so I think the strength of the dollar is going to contribute to more turmoil in emerging markets over the next 12 to 18 months. So taking a long-term view of investing, I think, is much better than chasing fads, because we see when people chase fads, they get caught in investment vehicles that aren't well suited to them. We just seen what's happened in the cryptocurrency world with this stable coins, Terra and Luna. Obviously, that caused quite a bit of damage around the world, quite a bit of loss of money for people, and I think South Korea was very much at the center of that disaster. So I always tell people, don't chase fads. Invest for the long term. Don't panic when markets go down. Basically put your money away in a diversified portfolio. and then look to see how much your money is worth 20 years from now. Not next week, not next month, not next year even.